it's great that it's medical students and some graduate students putting this thing together, and that you guys founded a rare disease, essentially student-centric group of folks that are looking at this. And I had a much longer title. It's now inherited diseases, but because of this, if you look at what we rare diseases, and the definition that most of the world uses is 1 in 2,000. It's a disease that's rare, often called orphan, found in less than 2,000 people. Now, if you look at these 1 in 2,000, well, about 80 to 85% are genetic, and almost all of those are inherited, which basically means they're single gene disorders, right? So that means out of the 24,000 genes that exist in the human genome, one is not working properly, and it results in a disease. And it's that simple. It's not a complicated disease to understand, as far as this is the cause of the disease. It's a single gene that's not working properly that then results in this disease. So it's one of the easiest when it comes to genotype phenotype, versus a lot of the more difficult to understand diseases, atherosclerosis, diabetes, cancers, that are plethora of things, including your genetics. So in terms of genotype phenotype, it's probably the easiest out there. Alrighty, but is 1 in 2,000 really so rare? And the answer is absolutely not. And I really dislike the term rare disease, even though your society's named that and many other things are. And that's because if you look at it, 1 in 40 babies born, including Canada, is born with an inherited disease. 1 in 40. Unfortunately, 95% have no treatment. 90% are life-limiting. 75% of the symptoms kick in when you're a kid. Unfortunately, half of these kids won't reach adulthood. So out of the 1 in 40, half won't reach adulthood. And if you actually go through a pediatric hospital and you start counting beds and say, which of these kids actually has an inherited disease? It's 1 in 3 beds is a kid with an inherited disease. 1 in 3. And they stay there longer than regular kids because they're sicker. Problem is, inherited diseases are not counted in our healthcare system. If you're saying, okay, I've got to code what this poor kid has, there's no checkbox for genetic or inherited disease. So these kids aren't counted. So then how can you decide how much resource you should put towards research and towards medicines and towards care for patients when you can't even count them in your system? And yet we know, if you look at it, when people do the math, at least half of all the money spent on medical care for kids is spent on so-called inherited or rare diseases. But it's half the money. That's not rare. That is the biggest expense and the most common type of disease kids have. Full stop. But we don't count them yet. We have to find a way to incorporate a way to count these kids into our system if we're actually going to pay any attention to them. So why do I think there's been very little research on orphan diseases? And there hasn't been compared to other diseases. And I think it's something, when you think it's the most common killer of kids in Canada, it's got the highest morbidity rate, the highest cost, the highest mortality rate of any type of disease in the entire country for kids. I think it's an accident to history. We think of cancer, and if you walk into a kid's hospital, there's a pediatric cancer ward. But cancer is 1,000 different diseases. But it started out as cancer and branched out. Okay, you can get brain cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer. And then you can break these down into 10, 20, 50 different kinds of breast cancer, depending on the combination of mutations that are present in the cell that will result in the cancer. So cancer is 1,000 different diseases at least, but it's called cancer. And it's counted and checkboxed as cancer. And then you go from there. Rare diseases or inherited diseases were the other way around. You found all these weird little diseases, but in the end, we know there's a cause. The single cause is mutation in a single gene gives you a disease. Cancer is a mutation in about 4 or 5 genes that gives you a disease. It's no different, but we just count it as cancer and then work our way from there. And you've got pediatric cancer wards. We don't have an inherited disease ward in hospitals, but we should. But we don't. So when kids go into the hospital with an inherited disease and it's neurological primarily, they're counted as a neuro kid. And if they pass away, they passed away from a neurological disease, not an inherited disease or a genetic disease. Makes no sense. So we need to do a better way of starting to do things like incorporating ICD coding for inherited diseases, and they exist, Orpha codes, into how we can actually count these kids. Because without counting them, they don't count and they don't get the resources required to actually do research on them, to treat them or to care for them. So why can we finally start thinking about these kids as inherited diseases as one large disease class? And that's really the cost of genomes. 2001, the first human genome was sequenced. It took 10 years and $3 billion. A lot of money. 2019, human genome can be sequenced in less than a week for $800. The thing about a genome is it's a test you do once. Your genome doesn't change. It's not like cholesterol levels, blood pressure levels. An MRI costs $2,000. We can do this test for $800 and you only have to do it once and you're done. You're good for life. So we need to start thinking more when it comes to inherited diseases and they show up at a doc's shop, to thinking more about genomes first versus genomes last. It's a cheap test. We should do it near the beginning rather than the end of the journey for these people. So just to put it in perspective, if one of you was going to go out and buy a fancy car back in 2005, let's say a nice Ferrari like this one for $394,000, to buy that same car, just in terms of cost of sequencing a person's genome, would now cost 40 cents. $394,000 down to 40 cents in 15 years. And it would be 250 times faster than that car you bought. So you can get a car that goes 250 times faster for 40 cents instead of $394,000. That's the decrease in the cost to sequence a genome in 15 years. So what does that mean? Well, it means we can now discover the genes that cause inherited diseases really, really quickly, because we can sequence the genomes of tons and tons of people that we couldn't before because it cost too much. So in 2009, 5 new human genes were identified using this so-called next generation sequencing, or using genomes. Now we're doing it at several hundred a year. So if you add that up over time, well, okay, we'll go back one step. So why do we care when you can actually identify the gene? Well, you get a DNA test for the disease. So instead of having to do the old-fashioned clinical diagnostic, you can now actually sequence somebody's genome or exome, and you've got a diagnostic test right there. So you can reduce the diagnostic time from several years to less than a month from the time you order the test, send it out, get the results back, and interpret it. You also now can get actually genetic counseling for patients, parents, carriers, that you couldn't without a diagnosis and without knowing the gene and how the mutation is present in person and how it's handed down between families. The other thing you get is insight into the molecular basis of the disease. With inherited diseases, there's a direct genotype to phenotype correlation. The mutation in this gene gives you this disease, full stop. Not any more complicated than that. And as a researcher, you can't get anything more scientifically tractable than this. So you get insight into the molecular basis of the disease, which is the very first step you need to think about a treatment or cure. Without that, it's next to impossible. So where do we stand now? As was pointed out earlier, and what still mostly happens is there's still the diagnostic odyssey for a lot of rare disease patients. 5 to 7 years from the time you show up with a symptom till you get a diagnosis, 3 to 5 misdiagnoses along the way, and it costs on average about 25 grand. Keep in mind, it's $800 for a genome. We currently take 5 to 7 years and spend 25 grand, and we think we're doing it the right way currently. Now, remember I said the cost of genomes had decreased so much? So there's 7,000 genes out of our approximately 24,000 that we think when mutated, or there's a variant in it, can cause an inherited disease. We got 5,500 of those 7,000 now identified. That means we got 1,500 to go. In 2020, the clinical genome is a reality. Actually, Genome Canada is funding a program right now, because in Canada, shockingly, every time you went to your clinicians and said, I wanted an exome or a genome done, it was sent to the US or Europe. We didn't do any of them in Canada. Last year, we did sequence 22,000 human genomes or exomes, but they were all done as part of research projects. Genome Canada is actually repatriating that, and they're paying for the machines and paying for the expertise and the CLIA lab certification. So that all of the genetic folks so Canadians' genomes who are sequenced through a clinical setting will now be done in Canada. And why does that matter? Well, in 2020, from the beginning of time till now, under 1 million human genomes have been sequenced. In 5 years, this will be 50 million. We're going from 1 million to 50 million in 5 years. What do you think that's going to do when it comes to being able to identify inherited diseases and their genes? We'll know them all. And we'll know almost all the variants within 5 years. I can tell you, in 2022, there's going to be the birth of the Canadian Human Genome Library, and we're launching that ourselves, which means everybody who has a genome sequenced in Canada as part of either clinical care or research study will have the opportunity to have their genome deposited into the library so that we can understand what keeps us healthy, makes us sick, and that will be attached to medical records. And if the person chooses to, we can actually then, because your genome is only sequenced once and it doesn't change for your life, we can ping their genome every few years and say, what do we know about the human genome that keeps us healthy, makes us sick? Return it back to the medical system and say, look, as a doctor, this is either an inherited disease, a risk for cancer, polygenic risk score that could predispose this person to atherosclerosis or diabetes or cancer prior to them getting the disease. So it's really going to change medicine big time in the next decade. 2023, we're trying to work with CAHS right now to get ICD coding, which are called Orphan codes, which do exist, embedded into ICDs within Canada, at least within the pediatric hospitals. And as I said, within 5 years, all inherited disease-causing genes will be known, as will almost all variants of uncertain significance. And by 2030, all babies born in Canada will have their genome sequenced at birth. It will be generation genome from there forward. And that's because all 7,000 inherited disease genes will be known, all the variants of uncertainty will be gone, and we'll be able to diagnose every single inherited disease at birth right away for a lot cheaper than it costs to do the 40 random genetic and biochemical tests we do right now on most newborns in 2020. So that'll be the case in 2030, generation genome from there forward. Right. So that's where the diagnostic thing ends. What about treatment? Once we know all the genes, what can we actually translate this into improved patient care? Nice thing, as I said, about inherited diseases is they're single gene disorders. You can model them using CRISPR by knocking in your allele or knocking out your gene in your favorite model organism, and many times you'll recapitulate the disease. And then you just have to say, how can we fix it? There's nothing more complicated than that. It's not like trying to come up with a model organism disease for cardiovascular disease or diabetes, where it's a bunch of genetics that we still don't understand and a bunch of environmental factors that can vary from person to person to person to person. For inherited diseases, patient in this gene gives you this disease. So then you can go ahead from a scientific point of view, that's a very tractable problem. You can fix that. How can you fix it? Well, there's gene therapy. As we know, AAV vectors can actually do so. CRISPR may come along and help with that. Right now, we're trying to, with AAV vectors, that's what we're using right now is one of the bases for COVID vaccines, right? The Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine are AAV vectors expressing part of the COVID spike protein. Instead, we'll just express the protein that's the gene that expresses the protein that's broken in these people and fix it. AAV vectors were problematic, but right now they're starting to become reality, and it's pretty clear that they're safe. We can also use enzyme replacement therapy, and we can also use drugs where you can either repurpose known drugs or come up with a new drug. All of these things are doable, but I do think gene therapy will be the way of the future, and it'll be coming faster than we think. And one of the other advantages about working in the so-called orphan disease space is the cost to move a therapy from, drug or therapy, this could be AAV vector, is shorter and cheaper by a lot compared to much bigger diseases, because the nature of your clinical trial is 8 to 10 kids, and it's a phase 1-2 combined trial, and then you can move it into the clinic or the market right away. So your clinical trial is really fast, really cheap compared to any other type of disease. So what are some of the advantages if you're trying to actually come up with a therapy for a kid who has an orphan disease or an inherited disease? Well, the Orphan Drug Act in the US and almost every country in the world other than Canada, shockingly, has an Orphan Drug Act that supports rapid review of orphan drugs. So you can get the review done really quick versus having to wait. And because of the smaller therapy clinical trial size, you have a lot lower development cost. As I said, it's usually a phase 1-2 combined safety efficacy trial, and then you're good to go. It's not a phase 1, then a phase 2, then a phase 3 on thousands of people. One of the other things you get if you get a therapy approved is a pediatric priority review voucher. The FDA gives you this, and that's basically a voucher that you auction off. So if you come up with a therapy for an inherited disease, the FDA gives you this voucher. And what it does is it enables any pharma company to then move a drug that would normally not get priority review, i.e. back of the line, to the front of the line. So if you got a drug that you think is going to make $1 billion as a big pharma, you're willing to buy one of these vouchers, and the going rate right now is somewhere between $100 to $200 million for this voucher to move your drug to the front of the line. So what does the rare disease person do with that money? He can do whatever he wants with it, but you can, if you're a government, you can plow it back into inherited disease research if you're the ones who actually came up with the therapy. Wouldn't that be a great way to actually constantly fund rare disease care and research? However, if you're looking at the 7,000 orphan diseases, 300 make commercial sense. The other 6,700 are not common enough for people, at least pharma companies or biotechs, to care about. They're too rare. So what are we going to do with these other 6,700? Well, I propose that with AAV, with the right regulatory space, and Canada is working on that now through Health Canada, you can get much more plug and play. Because if you're working with an AAV vector, which is a gene therapy vector, let's say AAV8, all of the stuff that's really expensive and hard to do, the pharmacology, so to speak, the PK, the PD, the ADME, the tox, for AAV8, it's the same, no matter what gene you have in it. The only thing you change is the gene. So you can get rid of all that. You've done it for 3-4 diseases. You know it's the same every single time. So you don't have to do this anymore. So you can actually say, you know what? For your IND enabling for your first in human trial, you don't have to do this anymore. It's going to save you years and millions of dollars to get from your mouse to your first in human trial. So we're working with Health Canada to try and get that sorted out. And then if that cost is gone and the speed is gone, that actually puts it within the reach of academic grants from CIHR, for example, and research hospitals to actually perform the clinical trials. And why is this important? Well, if you perform the clinical trial, the research and clinical trial, and you can afford to do it entirely within the academic and research hospital setting, who controls the price? You do. So you can price it at whatever you think. And usually that you can price it at cost, especially if you're a government funding this. So you can actually then price it at what it costs you to make it. And the interesting thing is they're already paying for my salary. I'm a professor. They're already paying for the doc salaries. They're already paying for the infrastructure and all the equipment. The only thing they have to coop is the R&D costs and the manufacturing costs. Not a lot of money. And when we talk to folks who are actually looking at AAV therapies that are fundraising on their own through GoFundMe pages and everything else for a rare disease that their child has, or they're trying to get to the market, their cost that they sell it at is $100,000, because that's the cost that the docs and the nurses and everything else requires to carry out the clinical trial. And that's $100,000 once, and then your kid's cured. And we could probably get that cost lower if we actually start to do it en masse. So I really think there's an opportunity here to do it right. And that goes back to the fact that at the very beginning, 1 in 40 kids is born with an inherited disease. 1 in 3 pediatric hospital beds is filled with an inherited disease kid. They take up half of the cost of all of the pediatric healthcare system, and yet we say they're rare. It's the most common thing and the biggest expense when it comes to child healthcare, mortality, and morbidity, full stop. And these kids deserve better, and we need to find a better way to talk about them and to think about them and to apply the appropriate level of resource so we can do better. So I'm done. Thank you.